migration and citizenship and genealogy of resistance movements. He's the co-author of Investigating the 1981 Massacre on the Law Constituting Force of Violence, the main report, The Repressed Voices of the Iranian Revolution, 2020, and the book project Decolonizing Political Concepts, which is forthcoming with Routledge. So, Shahin, please take the floor is yours.
First of all, I would like just to express my sincere gratitude to NEOD for offering us the platform to share the results of Rastyad's research on the 1981 massacre. I also want to especially thank my colleagues at Rastyad Collective, both inside and outside of Iran. Thanks to their incredible courage and dedication, our collective succeeded to document and uncover one of the darkest and highly neglected chapters of Iran's recent history. In my talk, I will briefly tell you something about the historical background which gave rise to the 1981 massacre. Then I will focus on our investigative journey and will present a few important findings of our research and the methodological challenges we faced to study the most extensive atrocity in Iran's recent history. So the 1981 massacre took place in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution. And I believe that many people in the West, and perhaps some of you in the audience, associate the Iranian Revolution with the Ayatollahs and the Islamic fundamentalists. In academic works and in historical accounts, this political insurrection is often being characterized as an Islamic revolution, which was led by Ayatollah Khomeini and his religious supporters. And this very characterization alludes to the history of extreme violence and totalitarian oppression, which is the subject matter of our gathering. But in fact, the Iranian Revolution should by no means be regarded as a uniform phenomenon. It embodied a field of struggle between two antagonistic forces. On the one hand, the revolution was the outcome of collective struggles of young revolutionaries who wanted to bring about a democratic change through equal participation of men and women, socialists, liberals, Democrats, nationalists, and ethnic minorities. But on the other hand, the leadership of the revolution was monopolized by fundamentalist clerics who wanted to establish God's divine order on earth, resembling the Middle Ages. For many reasons, the clerics had a strategic advantage in this struggle. But they were also exceptionally ruthless and well organized. In the first months after the revolution, they quickly took full control over state apparatus and organized their totalitarian suppressive machine, such as the Basij, the Revolutionary Guards, and the Islamic Revolutionary Courts. And I know that you have heard of these names in the recent uprisings. So historically speaking, the 1981 massacre was carried out on the pretext of this antagonistic struggle, which intensified with the Islamic Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution was an all-encompassing purge model on the Chinese Cultural Revolution and had similar catastrophic consequences. Following an executive order issued by Ayatollah Khomeini on 14 June 1980, the Cultural Revolution was orchestrated by the clerical rule to purify higher education from undesirable, non-Islamic, Western, leftist, or liberal elements. As a result of this oppressive policy, government forces closed universities from 1980 to 1993. So for 3 years, we had no universities in Iran. They banned all independent students' unions and violently occupied most university campuses. In the same period, the Islamic fundamentalists and their supporters carried out a series of policies with the aim of transforming Iranian society into a Shiite theocracy. This project of Islamification was manifested in the gradual enforcement of mandatory hijab for women, which has become quite topical these days, systematic exclusion of independent and secular political parties from the public domain, the expulsion of critical academics from universities, and the active harassment and persecution of intellectuals and artists. These oppressive developments gave rise to growing discontent among citizens and provoked massive protests in different parts of the country. About a year later, in June 1981, a series of large-scale demonstrations were organized by different opposition groups to oppose these policies. Obviously, the clerics responded ferociously, and Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa against critics and characterized them as apostates. In one of his important public statements, he underscored that all critics of the regime were enemies of Allah and Islam who had dug their graves with their own hands. And you think this is just a metaphor, but the actual meaning of this statement became quite clear a few days later. In the last week of June 1981, hundreds of young protesters and critics were arrested, and many of them, including Said Soltanpour, a prominent poet and playwright, we call him the Iranian Victor Khara, were sentenced to death by revolutionary courts. These events marked the beginning of the largest wave of mass executions that the country would witness in its recent history. From June 1981 to March 1982, that's just within 9 months, thousands of dissidents were subjected to systematic torture and summary executions on the religiously motivated charges of waging war against Allah and spreading corruption on earth. So the 1980 massacre is clearly a paradigm case of a state violence by which a totalitarian regime gets rid of its ideological enemies and as a result consolidates its power. And you might think that state violence of such a magnitude should be widely known to the general public and that there must be plenty of literature and human rights reports on the subject matter. However, the opposite holds true. When we actually decided to investigate the 1981 massacre, we realized that there were no scholarly works that offered reliable information about the nature and scope of this massacre. Nor was there any report or a study that had tried to document the identities of the victims and perpetrators based on scientific methods. And our encounter with this tragic knowledge gap was overwhelming and motivated us even more to collectively initiate our investigation into these atrocities. But it was also pretty obvious that the Iranian authorities would not allow a group of independent researchers to dig into a mass atrocity crime for which they are legally to be held accountable. So in our research project, we had to deal with all these non-ideal and complex circumstances. The first step that we undertook was to develop a rather unorthodox method that could offer us a suitable entry into this highly delicate topic. We crisscrossed a lot, dived into messy and disorganized archives, experimented with geolocation techniques, and carried out an extensive fieldwork in the largest cemetery of Iran. Through our archival research, we understood that many names of the executed dissidents were published in legal statements and press releases of revolutionary courts and revolutionary guards. To find these documents, we looked into state-run newspapers and collected more than 250 press releases and legal statements. This archival analysis allowed us to document the execution of more than 2,800 political dissidents in 85 cities who were executed by the Islamic revolutionary courts after show trials. These documents give a lot of information about the horrendous and unspeakable nature of state violence. For example, in some press releases, we read that political prisoners were forced to carry out the executions and face the traumatic experience of killing their own comrades with their own hands. At the same time, our field research offered undeniable evidence that many of these victims were minors. In this field research, we examined the grave locations of executed dissidents who were buried in the largest cemetery of Tehran, Beheşt-e Zahra. This case was chosen as Tehran had the largest number of victims in that period and in many respects could serve as a representative sample. In this cemetery, we geolocated and carefully examined 5 sites where most victims of the 1981 massacre were buried. To gather as much information as possible about the identities of the victims, we literally took photographs of every single gravestone and compared the data inscribed on the gravestone with our archival data and lists that were provided by political prisoners and survivors. In this way, we identified and documented the personal details of about 1,000 individuals who were executed during the 1981 massacre in the city of Tehran. And by using geolocation techniques, we finally geolocated and documented the exact grave locations of the victims and created 5 virtual cemeteries on Google Maps. And I think you can just see one of those virtual cemeteries we have created. And I mean, those spots, they actually indicate the grave location of more than 300 dissidents who were buried in section 87 of Beheşt-e Zahra. And our fieldwork had also another unsettling dimension. During our work, we came across 2 large sites in the cemetery which were systematically destroyed by the authorities. After a rather long and careful inspections, we collected first-hand material which showed that these sections contain the remains of hundreds, if not thousands, of political dissidents executed between 1980 and 1988. You can see one of the pictures just there. That's the picture of one of the sites which are actually quite completely destroyed by the government. So by adopting this methodological approach, we are now able to establish some important facts which are quite significant for understanding the legal and political nature of the mass killing. And let me summarize the most notable findings here. First of all, our study shows that at least 3,500 dissidents were executed or killed during the 1981 massacre in more than 85 cities. And it should be highlighted, and this is quite important to highlight, that this data represents only the tip of the iceberg. And the actual extent of the systematic mass killing is still unknown. Yet our data establishes that this massacre is the most extensive crime committed by the Islamic Republic. In fact, the entire political, legal, and military apparatus of the theocratic regime was in one way or another involved in this mass killing. It is important to note that many of the current high-ranking officials, including the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and President Raisi, they were involved in this massacre and they should be held accountable for this mass atrocity crime. The second observation is as follows. Our study offers hard evidence that more than 100 minors were killed during the massacre in the city of Tehran alone. And the youngest victim was just 11 years old. Moreover, this data shows that hundreds of young women, mostly teenagers, were subjected to practices of torture and summary executions. And this finding is quite significant for understanding the political logic behind government's cruel practices against young female protesters in recent uprisings. And third and finally, our research proves that unlike government's false propaganda, this massacre was not a response to the actions of a particular political party or ideology. Rather, it was a premeditated, state-sponsored violence which aimed at exterminating a large part of the political spectrum, representing different ideologies and worldviews that could pose a threat to the state's hegemony. This included intellectuals, scientists, artists, socialists, social democrats, members of Mujahideen Khalq and their sympathizers, nationalists, liberals, monarchists, ethnic minorities, and even the followers of the religious minorities such as the Baha'i faith. I'm just going to keep my talk here, but if you are interested to know more about Rastyad's research project, we have created an open source database which you can just consult. And this database contains the main findings of our research. It also includes personal profile of the victims and legal statements as well as geolocation data, and also a list of the alleged perpetrators who had a legal, political, and military responsibility during the massacre. And for now, just as a kind of a symbolic gesture, I would like just to hand over the key findings of our research project to Professor Javid Rahman and entrust it to the hands of someone who has for years been fighting for justice and legal accountability in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shahin, for that's a very, very gripping presentation indeed. Our next speaker has already